This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Empire of the Sun. Empire of the Sun was originally released in 2005 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman. This game supports 2 players and takes 6 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Empire of the Sun. In this episode, we're going to continue learning the sequence of play with the offensives phase. This phase begins with the initiative segment. Typically, the player with the most strategy cards go first and may play any card in their hand. However, the player with fewer strategy cards may play his future offensives card as an event card offensive to go first. In the event that players both have the same number of cards, the Japanese player must go first for all game turns in 1941 and 1942, whereas the Allied player must go first for all other game turns. In this case, the opponent may not use future offensive cards to go first. Next, we move into the offensive segment. Here, players will alternate playing and resolving strategy cards. The side currently playing a strategy card to conduct an offensive or implement other game functions with an event is known as the offensive player, which I've abbreviated to OP for some descriptions. The player waiting to take his turn is called the reaction player, or the RP for short. The reaction player is not a passive role though. At specific times, they may play blue-bordered reaction cards to interrupt the offensive player's actions. We will discuss reaction plays quite a bit in this episode. Displayed on the screen are example opening hands for the Japanese and Allied player for turn 2. Since the Japanese player has a hand of 7 cards, they win initiative and play the first card as the offensive player. The Allied player assumes the role of the reaction player. After the Japanese player's strategy card has been resolved, the players reverse roles and continue this process. The segment ends when both players have played all strategy cards in their hands for the current turn. Once the offensive player is determined, they have several options when playing a strategy card. The first option is they can play it as an operation card. The second option is they can play it as an event card. The third option is they can play it as a future offensive card. We'll look at this option in more detail in just a moment. And finally, they can discard it from their hand. To conduct an offensive, the card will be played as either an operation card or an event card. Both offensive types have a specific scale. Operation card plays are smaller in scope and thus have little logistical planning, and focused on one battle hex, and therefore more secret and harder for the enemy to detect. Event card plays are much larger in scope, have greater logistical planning, may involve multiple battle hexes, and therefore are less secret and easier to detect by the enemy. All of this information can be derived from the card's stats. To gauge the scope of a potential offensive, compare the operation value with the logistic value. These stats indicate the number of units activated in the offensive. You'll notice that the operation value on this card is a 2. However, when played as an event, the logistical value is 3. An offensive with an operation card play represents a localized action with a bare minimum of planning, which is why it is limited to one battle hex. The greater logistical planning and coordination of assets is spelled out in the specific event card text, which can encompass multiple battle hexes. However, the larger an operation, the more difficult it is to keep secret. This is reflected in the intelligence values at the top of the card. You'll notice that an OC, or an operation card intelligence value, is 4. The EC, or event card value, is 6. If the reaction player has an opportunity to make an intelligence die roll, They need to roll that number or less to succeed and learn about the offensive. This can change the intelligence condition of an air-naval offensive from the standard surprise attack to an intercept. Now that we know how to read the card stats in relation to an offensive, let's learn about future offensives. Let's discuss future offensives. Once per game turn, each player may designate one strategy card to be held over for a future game turn to conduct an offensive, event, or reaction. A player may never have more than one card designated as a future offensive card at any given time. Also, a player cannot designate a card as a future offensive card if one is currently designated. Basically, the current future offensive card must be played first before a new designation can be made. Also, players cannot designate strategy cards Tojo resigns or Soviets invade Manchuria. The procedure for designating a future offensive card is as follows. The player places their chosen strategy card face down and then puts the future offensive's marker on top of this card to indicate its status. Remember, creating a future offensive card counts as that player's action, and then play alternates to the other player. Once a future offensive card is designated, it is not counted for hand size purposes or initiative purposes. When playing a future offensive card that has already been designated, the player has two choices. First, they can use it to win initiative. At the start of the offensive phase, the player with fewer cards can win initiative by declaring they will play their future offensive as the first card. In this case, the future offensive must be played as an event card. Second, the future offensive can be played during the offensive phase. Be aware though, it cannot be played in the same game turn it was designated, and it cannot be the last card played in the offensive phase. Also, it cannot be discarded to fulfill a requirement. Other than these restrictions, it may be played at any time a player would normally play a strategy card. And now that we've discussed future offensives, let's move on to the offensive sequence. Each offensive can be completed in 14 steps. Now, that may seem like a lot of steps, but let's break it down, as not all these steps occur with each offensive. I've color-coded these steps. Black steps are driven by the offensive player and typically required to complete the offensive. Blue steps are opportunities where the reaction player may interrupt an offensive with a reaction card play. There are several types of reactions, but the reaction player cannot play every type in an offensive. There will also be offensives where no reaction cards are played. Keeping this in mind, the offensive process actually flows a lot faster than this 14-step process might seem. Also keep in mind that the distribution of card types between players is somewhat asymmetrical. There is a higher chance that the Japanese as a reaction player will interrupt an allied offensive with a reaction, because they have more of these card types. When the player is in the role of a reaction player, the only strategy cards that may be played are those that state in their title they are a reaction event, and only the player currently cast in the role of reaction player may play reaction cards. A reaction event may be played in response to an offensive after the offensive player has completed moving all offensive units, provided there are one or more declared battle hexes or the text of the card indicates that it may be played otherwise. A reaction player is limited to a maximum of 3 reaction events in response to a specific offensive, not per battle within that offensive. There are 5 categories of reaction events. Let's walk through them. Intelligence reaction cards are used to change the intelligence condition of an offensive. Attack reaction cards provide additional damage to the offensive player due to submarine, kamikaze, or skip bombing attack. Counter-offensive reaction events enable the reaction player to activate more units in reaction than would normally be possible, and alter the intelligence condition. Weather cards allow the Japanese player to cancel allied offensives. And finally, personage cards create an event focused on a specific famous person and allow unique effects. We will cover these in greater detail as we walk through each of these offensive steps. In Offensive Step 1, the offensive player may activate units with their HQ. First, the offensive player selects an in-supply HQ for their offensive. Then they may activate a number of units equal to the HQ's efficiency rating, plus, depending on the type of offensive, either the operation value or the event logistic value. Operation-based offensives are smaller in scale than event-based offensives and typically activate less units. In the example here, the HQ provides an efficiency of 1 plus an operation value of 2 from the card would equal 3 that can be activated. Choosing the event would be 1 for HQ efficiency plus 3 logistics value for the card play for a total of 4 units that can be activated. Be aware there are some HQ efficiency value modifiers in the game. The first is a lack of supply connection to the eastern map edge for US and joint HQs. Any in-supply joint or US HQ that cannot trace a valid supply line from the east map edge ultimate supply source has its efficiency rating reduced by 1. Please note, a 0 efficiency rating is possible. Second is a lack of China, Burma, India, also known as CBI, infrastructure. We don't have time to dig deep into this topic in this episode, but the lack or instability of roads, railways, and bridges can negatively impact Japanese HQs. When choosing units to activate, remember they must be within the command range of the HQ and in supply, which means that you can trace a path from the activated HQ to the unit. Also be aware that inter-service rivalry can limit activations for Japan and US forces. Therefore, players may only be able to activate Army units or Navy units, but not both. Finally, when conducting Allied offensives, check the Allied HQ National Command chart to ensure the unit you want to activate can take orders from that HQ. In Step 2, the offensive player moves their activated units. This is a big topic, so first let's cover the basics of movement. Each unit type has a base movement point allowance. Ground units are 1 movement point, or MP for short. Naval units are 5 movement points. Please note here that carriers have fighter wings that can be launched into combat with their own range in hexes. But remember, these fighter wings are tied to the location of the carrier. Finally, each air unit's movement point allowance is based on its range. Many air units have 2 range types, normal range and extended range. Be aware though, extended range has combat penalties. If the extended range number is in parentheses, then the unit cannot battle. If there are no parentheses, then its attack strength is halved. Next, take the unit's base movement point allowance and multiply it by the strategy card in play's operation value. This will tell you the total movement points that the unit has for the offensive. Finally, spend those movement points to enter hexes by their terrain cost. For ground units, that's 1 movement point for open terrain, 2 movement points for jungle and mixed terrain, and 3 movement points for mountains. There are also hexes that contain transport routes, such as major roads and railways. If these hexes are not occupied by enemy units, they can be entered at the cost of half a point. Keep in mind with ground units that some smaller scale offensives with low operational value will restrict them in their movement. Basically, by the time the ground unit hacked its way through the jungle, the offensive would have already been over. Next, naval units' ocean terrain costs 1 movement point. Be aware though, there are hexes with lighter shade of ocean blue. These lighter blue hex sides are uncrossable. And then there are air units. Air units can enter any hex at a cost of 1 movement point. However, they must contend with fuel consumption to stay in the air and thus travel by legs. Legs are the distance an air unit can travel before it must land at a friendly airfield to refuel. An air unit's total movement points are divided into legs based on the operation value. For example, the air unit on the screen has a normal range of 2. The strategy card shown on the screen has an operation value of 2. That means the air unit can travel 2 hexes, land at a friendly airfield, then travel 2 more hexes, and then land at a friendly airfield. Air units with extended range can move farther before they have to land, but remember, they do so with combat penalties. There are specific requirements for naval units ending their movement. Let's walk through them. Naval units must end their movement in a hex with enemy units, as shown in example A and B, with friendly carrier and non-carrier units that may participate in a battle, as shown in example C, containing a friendly port, example D, or controlled by the enemy but not occupied, that contains a friendly ground unit that entered by way of amphibious assault, shown in example E. Let's discuss the various offensive movement types. First, there's terrain-based movement, which we just discussed. This is for offensive and reaction units. Basically, units expend movement points as they move through hexes, and players should always move a unit or one stack of units at a time. Then there is strategic movement or transport, depending on whether it's a ground, air, or naval unit. This movement type is eligible for all Japanese, US, Commonwealth British, except their Armor Brigade, Australian, and New Zealand units. Dutch, Indian, and Chinese units are ineligible. Strategic movement, or transport, basically allows units to move 2 times the movement point value allowed by the current offensive. Air and naval units must end their movement at a friendly airfield or port, and units are ineligible to conduct post-battle movement. There are some additional rules in regard to air and naval units and zone of influence. When using strategic movement, units cannot enter hexes with enemy zone of influence, units do not exert their own zone of influence while moving, and units do not neutralize opposing zones of influence. The unit regains their own zone of influence immediately after it has ended its move. Continuing on with offensive movement types is Amphibious Assault. This is for offensive and reaction ground units. Eligibility is the same as strategic movement, and as we saw in the earlier episode, at the cost of 1 amphibious shipping point, a unit may move from any coastal hex with or without a port to any other coastal hex with or without a port at a distance equal to that of a naval unit in the current offensive. And finally, there's ground disengagement. This is for the reaction player's ground units. With this type of movement, the reaction player's ground units may move from a hex containing an opposing offensive ground unit or units that just entered the hex as long as the following conditions apply. The ground units cannot move into the hex where the opposing units came from, and the reaction player's attack strength must be greater than the opposing units in the hex. If successful, the reaction player's ground units may move to the desired hex regardless of terrain cost. In Step 3, the offensive player will declare their battle hexes. A battle hex must be declared if it contains offensive and reaction units, including HQs. A battle hex may be declared if it contains reaction units only, but is in range of the activated offensive player's air and carrier units that are not taking part in other battles. And finally, a battle hex may not be declared in non-coastal hexes in China. For most battle participants, for each declared battle hex, the offensive player must state which units will participate in the battle for that hex. No unit may participate in more than one battle per offensive, and all units in a battle hex must take part in that battle. For carrier participants, if the assigned covered hex becomes a battle hex by way of special reaction, the carrier must take part in that battle. Every carrier unit that did not end its move in a friendly port must be either declared to participate in a battle hex within its range or to cover a friendly ground unit making an amphibious assault on an empty enemy-controlled hex. And finally, Any carriers that ended their move in a friendly port hex and any activated air units that are not participating in a declared battle hex may, but are not required to, be assigned to cover a battle hex within range the same way. In Step 4, if the reaction player has a weather reaction card, they may play it to end the current Allied offensive. Keep in mind, only the Japanese player has weather reaction cards. There are 3 of them. The strongest is Halsey's Typhoon, which adds some weather-related losses for the Allied player to reconcile. If the offensive is cancelled, place all units back to their starting location, remove event reinforcements and replacements, and place the used offensive card in the discard pile. Also, return any ASPs used during the offensive, and with that, the offensive is cancelled. If the reaction player does not play a weather reaction card, then proceed to the next step. In Step 5, the offensive player will apply any event bonuses. Keep in mind, this step is only for event-based offensives. Operation-based offensives can skip this step. In this step, it's important to recognize any event card bonuses prior to a potential reaction in the next few steps. For example, on our Operation RE card played for the event, the Japanese player gains a +1 ground combat dice roll modifier if any brigade-sized ground units are involved in a ground combat during this offensive. In Step 6, the reaction player may attempt Special Reaction. With this step, the reaction player is attempting to detect their opponent's forces using their unit's zones of influence. If they can detect enemy forces with a successful intelligence die roll, they can then create new battle hexes and change the intelligence condition from surprise attack to intercept. The conditions for special reaction are as follows. An opposing ground unit ends its offensive move in an unoccupied reaction player-controlled city, port, airfield, or resource hex. And this occurs within the range of a reaction HQ and within reaction aircraft's zone of influence, whether neutralized or not. So basically, a ground unit moves into one of these reaction player hexes, and even if there are no defending forces there, as long as it's within the range of a reaction HQ and it's within an aircraft zone of influence, they can make a special reaction attempt. As long as that invading unit is within range of a reaction HQ and within reaction aircraft zone of influence, the reaction player can attempt a special reaction and try to detect the invasion. For the special reaction attempt, the reaction player makes an intelligence die roll for each hex where the conditions are met. Be aware that play of a reaction card cannot be used. However, there is a -2 for zone of influence modifier that still applies. A successful die roll converts the hex into a battle hex. And now that we've reached Step 6, and we're nearing the end of this episode, let's pause for an example on special reaction. Now, let's look at a brief example for special reaction from the rulebook. While the rulebook doesn't state the earlier steps in the example, let's just assume that the Allied player has played card number 21, Operation Cartwheel, as an operation, and kicks off a new offensive. To be clear, we'll be running this operation off the stats at the top of the card, not the event. Therefore, in Step 1, the operation value is a 3. This means the Allied player can activate 3 units with their HQ. Now, the HQ is off screen in this example, but it's most likely the SW Pack HQ. And yes, that HQ has an efficiency value of 2, which would give us 5 activations, but we're only going to activate 3 units for this example. So, with the SW Pack HQ as our activating HQ, we are going to activate the CV Carrier Enterprise, the SF Brigade, both which are off screen, and the 5th non-LRB AF unit. All are well within the SW Pack's command range of 20. Next, in Step 2, the offensive player is going to move their activated units. First, the US SF Brigade uses Amphibious Assault to enter Hollandia, and the 5th non-LRB AF supports the SF Brigade landing. Next, the CV Enterprise moves into the Hollandia Hex. It may look like a land hex, but there is actually a harbor there. In Step 3, the offensive player declares that the CV Enterprise will attack the Japanese air unit at 2 hex range in Biak. Therefore, this becomes a battle hex. But notice that Hollandia does not get declared as a battle hex. Prior to the Allied units moving in, it was a vacant hex, and to qualify as a battle hex requires an opponent. The reaction player does not have a weather reaction card to play, so we skip Step 4. In Step 5, the offensive player would add any event bonuses, but we did not play an event, so we skip this as well. Now, we're at Step 6 for special reaction. The Japanese air unit's zone of influence covers the Hollandia Hex. As a result, the Japanese unit may be aware of Allied activity in the area. Therefore, this hex is eligible for special reaction, and may attempt to establish a new battle hex in Hollandia. This determination is made in Step 7 with an intelligence die roll. The die result is compared against the strategy card's intelligence value for operation card, which was how it was played. If the die result is equal to or below this value, then the Japanese successfully detect the invasion, and a battle hex is created in Hollandia. Then in Step 8, the reacting player can make reaction moves. They use their South Seas HQ to activate the Yamato battleship, which then moves into Hollandia to attack. And now that we've completed this example, this is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode of this series, we will continue learning the offensive sequence. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel and click the bell icon for notifications so you'll be notified when the next episode becomes available. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.